In early 2018, I was in southern Germany for a short-term consulting contract. I was staying alone in a business hotel on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. After work one evening, with no local contacts and no scheduled obligations, I did what I often did at the time, and I opened up a dating app. I started chatting with a man who lived outside of the city centre. His profile appeared pretty normal, his photos were recent, and his conversation was coherent. And so we agreed to meet at a point roughly between my hotel and his home. The meeting location turned out to not be at a bar or a cafe, but a sort of lightly trafficked residential area near farmland. I walked several kilometers to get there, and when we met in person, he matched his photos and appeared physically attractive too. However, his demeanor was markedly different from his online behavior. He was withdrawn, spoke very little, and didn't really ask too many questions. I carried most of the conversation while he gave some brief responses. Despite the mismatch, I continued the interaction though, and after about 20 minutes of walking, he suggested that we go to his place instead. I accepted, partly out of inertia and partly because nothing overtly alarming had happened yet. But his home was a detached house well outside of the urban area. During the walk there, my phone signal degraded and eventually disappeared entirely. When we arrived, the house was furnished in a sort of outdated and inconsistent style. He explained that it had belonged to a relative and that he now lived there alone. There were no personal items visible beyond basic necessities, but in the kitchen he mentioned that he was cooking dinner. The food was simmering on the stove, but he did not offer any. We moved to the living room and we sat. At that point, he became more talkative too. He explained that he worked in a textile design place and claimed to use proprietary digital fabrication techniques or something to that effect. He then began discussing a well-known European designer, asserting that he had stolen his work and sabotaged his career. He showed me recordings of his own presentations, alongside videos of the other designers' shows, narrating them in great detail. His interpretation of events did not appear grounded in reality though, but I didn't challenge him because, well, I just wasn't sure. Eventually though, he initiated physical contact. The interaction was awkward and brief, and he then stood up and said that he needed to get something upstairs. He went to the second floor and closed the door behind him. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I called up the stairs to ask if everything was okay. He responded affirmatively, but didn't come down. When I asked whether I should join him, he told me to stay where I was. At that point, I began to reassess the situation too. I attempted to leave quietly, but discovered that the front door was actually locked. I checked a secondary exit near the kitchen. It was also locked. I returned to the living room and waited, listening. I didn't hear any water, footsteps, or conversation, only the occasional movement overhead. After, I would say, maybe 45 minutes, he finally returned downstairs. His expression was neutral, and he stated directly that he wanted to have sex. I declined, though, and said that I needed to leave at this point. He responded that it was too late for me to go, and repeated his request. I then asked to use his Wi-Fi so that I could navigate back to my hotel since my phone had no service. He pointed at a router under a chair and told me the password was printed on it. While crouched down reading the label, I became aware of him watching me closely from behind. At one point, he leaned forward and reached behind a piece of furniture out of my view. At that moment, I interpreted the situation as potentially dangerous, and so I stood up quickly, picked up a nearby lamp and told him to unlock the door. He appeared confused, rather than hostile, and said that I was free to leave. When I told him the door was locked, he seemed surprised. He led me into the kitchen and said that the keys were in a drawer. The room lights were off though, and He opened the drawer which contained utensils and retrieved the keys. I turned on the light myself during this exchange. There was no physical confrontation, thankfully. He unlocked the door and I exited immediately, but as I was leaving, I looked back up the stairs where he had been for said 45 minutes before, and that was when I saw someone standing at the railing with a white mask on, dressed completely in black. Well, upon seeing that, I ran and, mind you, I was still holding the lamp until I reached the road, upon which I ditched it, and I walked for nearly 2 hours to return to my hotel, constantly looking over my shoulder. Once back, I blocked him on all platforms that I could identify using his name on, which I had learned earlier from the materials that he showed me. I never contacted the police, as technically no explicit crime had occurred, and I could not clearly articulate what I would report anyway. But when I think back on it, I realize just how stupid of a decision this whole thing was. Really, I should never have been there. I should never have gone to see him where we went to, and it was silly, and it was a lesson learned, and also perhaps a tragedy avoided. The earliest incident occurred in late 2021, here in rural western Kentucky, on a property that my family has lived on for decades now. Several homes belonging to relatives are spread across a single parcel of land, bordered by public roads. Behind the houses is a mix of unmanaged woods, low wetlands, and informal footpaths used regularly by family members. The first account comes from my younger sister, who was around 13 at the time. She and 2 friends, they were outside in the backyard near dusk, sitting on a rope swing attached to a large oak tree, and according to her, the atmosphere changed abruptly. Her friend stopped talking, appeared visibly unsettled, and repeatedly looked toward the tree line to her right. After a short period of hesitation, they insisted on going inside and stood on the back porch, urging her to follow. My sister reports that she remained seated for a brief moment, distracted and slow to react. When she became fully aware again, she noticed a strong sense that something was positioned close to her, within her peripheral vision. When she looked down to the side, she claims that she saw only the lower portion of a figure, elongated legs ending in hoof-like shape, with skin that appeared pale, irregular, and really unhealthy. She didn't describe a face or an upper body or anything. Rather than running immediately, she stood and walked toward the house at a steady pace. She later explained that she had read advice online suggesting that panic could escalate dangerous encounters, and she attempted to behave as if nothing was wrong. As she walked, she reported hearing a low vocal sound and what she described as joint-like cracking noises behind her. After several seconds of silence, she heard the same sound closer and then ran the remaining distance into the home. She was pretty distressed, no doubt, but uninjured, thankfully, and she and her friends stayed together inside for the rest of the night. Now, later that same night, while staying in my bedroom, one of her friends reported seeing someone pass through the hallway toward the bathroom early in the morning. The figure matched my general build and clothing from the previous day, and when my sister later realized that I wasn't home that night, and confirmed by phone that I had stayed overnight elsewhere, the incident became a topic of concern among them. Nobody else in the household reported being awake at that time too, which was very weird. Now, I initially dismissed this story as exaggerated, fear-influenced by online content. That position, though, changed several weeks later after my own experience. So while walking alone along one of the footpaths behind the houses in daylight, I stopped near an area where several young trees had bent inward over time, forming a sort of narrow archway. As I examined the area, I noticed movement across a marshy section roughly 30 feet away. I observed what appeared to be a tall, thin figure moving laterally between dense brush, but only the upper portion was visible. The movement was weird, though. It was rigid and lacked the normal shoulder motion associated with human walking. I didn't see any facial features. I also didn't observe it reacting to my presence or anything. I left the area immediately, though, without investigating any further. After that, though, there were a number of small additional incidents reported by my sister. On one occasion, she and a friend were sitting inside an old truck parked near the yard when both noticed a light-colored shape at the edge of the woods. Our dog, who was with them, became visibly distressed, shaking and whining. They remained inside the locked vehicle until morning, and no physical evidence was found afterward. They did look. Other reports were less specific, though. Tapping sounds at windows, movement heard near open windows, and on one instance, where I worked during the night with the impression that somebody was nearby, this was followed by sounds of retreating when I moved. When I checked outside, there was nothing there, though. There were also infrequent animal-like vocalizations from the woods at night that didn't match local livestock or wildlife here, though no recordings were ever made, so I never really got the chance to really double-check it, I guess you could say. The most recent event occurred when my sister was laying in bed with her cat resting on her chest, and after the cat moved away, she reported hearing the same sound of purring coming from outside of her open window, consistent in rhythm but unnatural in repetition. She waited until it stopped before closing the window, but thankfully nothing further happened. At present, there's no active concern from my family, and they live on the property still, and life continues on as normal. Whatever the cause of these things are, they seem to have slowed down over the years, thankfully, but they've still left behind a very uneasy feeling of unresolved tension, I guess you could say, and questions that are ongoing and still remain unexplained. In the mid-1990s, when I was 18 years old, I spent about a year living on an informal communal property. It was not an organized settlement so much as a collection of shared dwellings on privately owned land, bordering a state conservation area. People came and went, and there was little structure, no fixed leadership, and no expectation of permanence or anything. Most of us were there because, well, we had nowhere else to be. One afternoon in late winter, 3 of us decided to walk one of the old access tracks that cut through the bush behind the property. The track was no longer maintained, and it had originally been used decades earlier for logging vehicles. The weather was pretty poor that day, light rain, low cloud cover, and limited visibility. There was nothing unusual about going out there. People use those tracks all the time. After about 20 minutes of walking, I separated briefly from the others to relieve myself off the side of the trail. They continued ahead at a slow pace, and I moved only a short distance off the track, enough to just be out of sight to do my business. Now, while standing there, I noticed movement ahead of me, slightly downslope. There was a child. They stepped into view from behind the trees. Based on the height and the build, I estimated him to be around maybe 10 or perhaps 11 years old. He was barefoot and wearing clothing that did not match the time period. The short trousers held up with suspenders and a plain shirt without any visible branding or modern features. His hair was cut evenly and very short, in a way that perhaps suggested that it was done at home rather than at a barber or something. He didn't speak. He did not acknowledge me directly, and he stood still for several seconds, then turned and walked back into the bush at a normal pace. I called out reflexively, more out of confusion than concern, and finished what I was doing. By the time that I stepped back onto the track, he was gone, though. There was no sound of running and no obvious path that he could have taken that quickly. When I caught up with the other 2, I told them what I had seen. They dismissed it immediately, though, and suggested that I had just misidentified a hiker or maybe imagined something. Given the environment that we were living in at that time, that explanation was easy for them to settle on, and I didn't argue, but I was confident about what I had seen too. Well, a few days later, we were in a small coastal town nearby. One of my friends mentioned the incident casually while talking to a man who had grown up in that region. The man asked me to repeat the details, specifically the location and how the child was dressed. After listening, he told me that in the early 20th century, a local family had lost a son while working bushland in that same area. The child had apparently wandered away from a temporary camp and was just never recovered. And apparently the description that I gave, well, it matched how the boy appeared in one of the few surviving photographs of him. There was no claim beyond any of that, no suggestion of anything unexplained, and the man simply stated the facts as he knew them, and he just sort of left it there. I did return to the track many times afterward, and I never saw anything similar again. Eventually, I moved away, and I guess you could say that I grew up, and it's just something that's always sat with me in a sort of weird way. I never did forget the face of that boy, and after doing a bit of research too, I did actually find a picture of a boy that eerily looks very similar from that area, and I would guess is the boy that man told me about. I was living alone in a rented townhouse on the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas. I was 21 years old and working irregular shifts at a distribution warehouse. My sleep schedule at the time was pretty inconsistent, and I frequently returned home exhausted in the early afternoons. Now, at the time, I kept 2 pet birds, small parrots, confined to a single bedroom when I was out of the house. As a bit of a habit, I left a television running at low volume during the day, both for ambient noise and to mask outside sounds as well. This routine, it has been consistent for years without any issues. On the day in question, though, I returned home shortly after 2:30 p.m. I went directly to my bedroom, secured the birds into their enclosure, and changed some clothes. A cooking show was playing on the television at the time, and after lying down, I decided the noise was distracting and turned the television off manually. I then lay on my side and I began to drift into sleep. Now, at some point during the transition between wakefulness and sleep, I became aware of auditory input consistent with speech. The sound resembled a television program continuing in the background, so I opened my eyes and confirmed that the screen was dark and the device was powered off. I attributed the sound to somebody outside or something, and so I just closed my eyes again. Within moments, though, I felt a shift in pressure on the mattress near my back, followed by movement in the bedding consistent with weight distribution. The sensation matched what would normally occur if another person sat or laid down on the bed. My initial assumption was that a family member had entered the room, despite knowing logically that no one else was home at that hour. I remained still and I didn't turn immediately. My heart rate increased and I was sort of frozen. After several seconds, I rolled over and confirmed that the bed was empty. There was nothing there and the room appeared unchanged. I turned back toward the wall, pulled the blanket over my head, and I fell asleep shortly afterward. I woke again at around 6 p.m. feeling unsettled but functional. I left the room and spoke with my mother later that evening about what I had experienced. She attributed it to stress and poor sleep habits, and so no further action was taken. In retrospect, while the event was pretty convincing at the time, it didn't reoccur under any comparable conditions, and I didn't find any other corroborating factors to go with it. And so, with distance and some context, I guess maybe it was like sleep paralysis or something like that. Still, it was frightening and something that I will never forget. In early 2021, while completing the final year of my undergraduate degree, I was living in a single-family home in northern Colorado with my parents. The house, it had been constructed privately by family members in the late 1990s, and I had lived there since childhood. Because of this, I had always assumed the environment was pretty neutral and very familiar, with no prior occupants or notable history beyond my own family. But that assumption changed when I learned through an offhand conversation with a relative that a close family member had actually died inside of the house years before I was born. The death, it was related to substance abuse and occurred in a common living area. This information, it had never been shared with me directly and contradicted what I had believed growing up. And while the discovery itself was pretty upsetting, I'll admit, it also caused me to reconsider a series of experiences that I had previously dismissed as unrelated sleep or maybe stress events. You see, as a child, most unusual experiences occurred during sleep. This included vivid dream imagery and brief episodes of waking confusion. At the time, I associated them with anxiety and an active imagination. But as I entered my late teens, the experiences became more distinct, I guess you could say, and occurred closer to full wakefulness as well. During that period, I was under a lot of academic stress and experimenting with meditation and visualization exercise intended to improve focus. I discontinued these practices, though, after several months, due to reoccurring intrusive thoughts and disrupted sleep as well. One incident in particular, though, occurred when I was 19. I'd gone to bed pretty late that night and was lying face down when I became partially aware of a physical sensation consistent with pressure on my arm or something. The limb was numb, though, and my movement was suddenly restricted, though not completely immobilized. When I turned my head, I perceived a human-like shape in my peripheral vision near the bed. The image lacked detail and faded quickly, and I was fully awake afterward, my heart racing, and I immediately left the room to speak with my dad. We discussed the event at length, and he attributed it to sleep paralysis combined with exhaustion. And as comforting as that might have been, I didn't sleep that night. Another incident occurred the following year when I was home alone during the afternoon one day. I was in the bathroom with the door closed, and I heard sustained footstep sounds in the hallway. Believing that another family member was there, I called out several times without any response. I then used my phone to call my mother. Her phone rang audibly from another room, but was not answered. When I contacted my dad, he confirmed both parents were away and that my mother had left her phone behind. After the call ended, the sound stopped. Eventually, I made my way out of the bathroom and checked everywhere, but there were no signs of anyone there and nothing had been moved. After these events, though, I became more attentive to environmental explanations. Like, the house has older flooring, there's insulation here that's pretty old as well, plumbing that produces noises with temperature changes. I also learned that stress, fatigue, and expectation can significantly influence sensory perception, particularly in quiet or isolated conditions. Still, though, with all that in mind, I really still cannot explain what happened that day. All I can say is that it wasn't normal and that I really don't know what to make of it. In the mid-2000s, when my brother and I were both under 10 years old, we were living in a suburban area just outside of a town. It was a typical weekend sort of household, both parents present, no unusual routines, nothing out of the ordinary about the morning in question. And what stands out about the event is not how dramatic it was in the moment, but just how ordinary it seemed until it stopped making any sense. So, we woke up early on a Saturday and we went downstairs to watch some television. From the living room, there was a clear view of the driveway through a large front window, and we noticed that our mother's car was not parked where it usually was. Based on routine alone, we assumed that she had gone out briefly to meet someone from church or run an errand and would return shortly. This was a pretty normal occurrence at the time, and Genuinely, it didn't raise too much concern. After some time passed, though, long enough for the cartoons to cycle through at least one program, we both heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. The driveway surface was loose stone, and the sound of tires on gravel was pretty unmistakable. We both looked toward the window and saw the car enter the driveway and stop partway up in its usual parking position. What followed, though, was the first irregularity. No door opened. No engine shut-off sound was obvious, and nobody exited the vehicle. We waited, expecting movement that just never came. After a few minutes, my brother commented that it was strange how our mother hadn't come inside yet. We discussed it briefly and decided that somebody should check on her in case there was a problem. My brother went outside while I stayed inside watching the TV. He returned quickly and told me that the car was empty, though, and locked. At first I assumed that he was mistaken or that he was trying to play a prank on me, but his demeanor suggested otherwise. We both tried to reconcile what we had seen with what we had found, and neither of us had heard any footsteps, doors opening, or the car being locked or anything. At that point, I told him to go and wake our dad up, who we assumed was still asleep. He went upstairs again, and when he came back, he looked shaken and said that both parents were in bed and had not been downstairs. This immediately shifted the situation from confusion to concern. I checked the usual place where the car keys were kept, expecting at least them to be missing, but the keys were exactly where they always were. The most unsettling detail, though, which we discussed repeatedly over the years, was the way the car had stopped. The driveway had a sort of noticeable incline on it, and if the vehicle had been rolling freely or malfunctioning or something, it should not have stopped on its own. It should have continued down toward a fence at the back. But instead, it came to a rest cleanly, as if actively controlled. As adults, we have genuinely tried to rack our brains over how any of this was possible, but we just have never come up with anything. Our parents at the time dismissed the event entirely, attributing it to imagination or shared misunderstanding. No other events occurred before or after it, which was weird too, and there were no missing items in the car and no evidence of anyone else in there. Also, there were no mechanical issues reported with the car at the time, so really we just have no idea how it's even possible that it happened. Which means that the whole thing just remains really unusual and pretty much unexplainable. I was in primary school, roughly 9 years old, and living with my family in a 2-story house on the outskirts of Sheffield, England, when this happened. The house itself was pretty unremarkable. Standard layout, no unusual history, no prior incidents. At the time of this event, too, there was nothing really bad happening in my life or anything. It was early evening, not late at night, and I was upstairs in my bedroom, seated on the floor, sorting through some toys. I was alert, not tired, and had not been in bed or preparing to sleep or anything. The hallway and the living room lights were on downstairs, and I could hear my parents talking while watching television. Their presence was clear and pretty continuous, and from where I was sitting, I could see a textured glass panel set into the stairway wall. The panel was designed to let light pass through while obscuring detail. It faced an enclosed garden rather than the street, and was positioned well above ground level as well. There was no external structure that would allow someone to stand near it from the outside. And so, while I was playing, I noticed a change in the light pattern on the glass all of a sudden. At first, it registered as movement rather than a defined shape, but after a few seconds it resolved into what appeared to be the outline of a head and a partial shoulder maybe or something. It was visible only as a distorted silhouette through the patterned surface, but the coloration was caused by outdoor lighting reflecting through the glass, and it appeared sort of greenish rather than neutral. The shape, It didn't face inward toward the room. Instead, it remained angled, as though viewed in profile. A second shape appeared beneath it, though, consistent with an arm positioned forward. The hand shape moved once in a repeated circular motion, similar to a beckoning gesture, I would say, and the movement was slow and deliberate, not abrupt. At the time, I didn't interpret this immediately as a person. My reaction was sort of delayed, confused, rather than instant fear, I guess you could say. But after several seconds, I began crying loudly, which prompted my parents to come upstairs. As their footsteps reached the top of the stairs, the silhouette shifted laterally across the glass panel rather than disappearing outright. It moved out of the visible area without changing orientation, and my parents entered my room within moments. I pointed toward the stairwell and attempted to explain what I had seen. They checked the landing, the stairs, and the exterior garden area, but nothing was found. They said that it was maybe just the reflection or headlights or imagination, and after calming me down, they returned downstairs. Now, about 15 minutes later, while I remained in my room with the lights still on, the same pattern appeared on the glass again. This time the movement was briefer though, and I called out immediately and my parents came upstairs again. But the shape was gone by the time that they had reached the landing. No further incidents occurred that night or at any point forward too. Now, what remains particularly weird about this situation is that really, there's nowhere anyone could stand for that shadow or whatever it was to appear behind the glass like that. I mean, if someone had, they would have had to have been 10, maybe 11 feet tall at least. So, I just really don't know how that's possible. Also, after a lot of thinking about this, I really just don't know how to explain it. I mean, it was a silhouette of a person and they beckoned me over, which is very creepy to think about. I was living in a rented apartment with 2 other tenants when this happened. The building, it sat along a narrow river used primarily for drainage and small boats. The water level was visible from our kitchen windows, in fact, which faced directly onto the embankment. One of the people that I lived with had a long-standing habit tied to his personal beliefs. After dinner, he would take a small amount of uneaten food and discard it outside, usually into the water or nearby vegetation. He viewed it as a symbolic gesture rather than necessity, and over time it became a part of our household routine. Nobody objected to it, and it had been happening regularly since before I even moved in. That routine ended abruptly, though, when he left for several weeks for work-related travel at one point. During his absence, the apartment's daily rhythm just suddenly changed. Meal times became less structured, and the kitchen was used at odd hours. Around the same period, the weather shifted sharply too. Humidity increased, and the building's insulation, already pretty poor, became even more noticeable. The kitchen began to feel different from the rest of the apartment, though. Not dramatically colder in a measurable sense, but consistently uncomfortable, particularly late at night. More than one person independently commented on feeling uneasy while preparing food alone there. The sensation was described less as fear and more as a sort of heightened state of alertness, as if somebody else was nearby, despite nobody being present. Along with this came minor but persistent disturbances too, like the refrigerator door was found ajar more than once without anyone recalling opening it. Cutlery was occasionally heard shifting after everyone had left the room. Once or twice, items were dropped during meals without a clear cause. And while none of these incidents were extreme, they accumulated and became difficult to ignore. Physical discomfort also became pretty common as well. Headaches, fatigue, mild nausea, all of it was reported by all occupants at different times, and these symptoms were inconsistent and resolved when we spent time outside the apartment. No one experienced them elsewhere, which was really weird. One evening, While all three of us were present, the atmosphere in the kitchen felt especially tense that day. I spoke aloud, partly out of frustration, asking if there was a reason the space felt so uncomfortable, and immediately afterward, I experienced a sudden weird reaction, chills instantly across one side of my body, and involuntary muscle responses, maybe similar to adrenaline spikes or something like that. At the same moment, one roommate described shortness of breath and another reported pressure across the upper back and neck. And it was then that literally all hell broke loose. The entire kitchen, I mean, every drawer, every door, the refrigerator, the oven, everything began moving on its own. And when I say moving, I don't just mean slightly. I mean, these things were opening and closing, banging back and forth, but there was no one there and there was nothing to be seen. We all freaked out and we instantly tried to get out of the apartment. Problem was that we couldn't get the door open. It was as if someone was on the other side, holding the door handle and not allowing us to get out. In the end, we ended up taking a balcony door, a sliding glass door that was still open at the time, and we just sort of dangled off the edge and we just ran. After we caught our breath, we all began talking about what the heck that was and how to explain it. None of us could ever really explain what that was about, but it wasn't long after this that our friend returned, began doing their little ritual thing again, and everything seemed to quieten down. Over the following weeks, the uneasy sensation faded, the kitchen returned to feeling neutral, and the physical symptoms stopped as well, with no further explanation as to how any of this happened. It wasn't long after this, too, that I eventually moved out and was followed by the others, with only that one roommate left there, who seemed to be completely undisturbed by any of it. During my final year of secondary school, I was living with my family in a mid-rise apartment complex. At the time, most of my days were spent preparing for standardized exams, often studying well past midnight. We had moved into the unit earlier that year, and I was still adjusting to the layout and the ambient noise of the building. One night, after several hours of revision, I went to bed without fully winding down, and the lights were off, but the room was not dark. Exterior lighting from nearby buildings and passing traffic reflected faintly through the window beside my bed. The bed was positioned close to that window due to limited space, which meant that shadows and reflections were always visible in my peripheral vision. While laying flat and staring upward, I looked toward the lower end of my bed, and what I registered did not align with what I expected to see. Near my feet, I perceived what looked like an additional limb occupying the space where nothing should have been. It appeared thicker and longer than my own leg, with a sort of muted grey tone and poor visual definition as if partially obscured. Above it, there was a darker shape that lacked detail but suggested mass rather than emptiness. My immediate response was confusion, though. I attempted to shift my head to get a clearer angle, but found that I couldn't move all of a sudden. My arms and legs just wouldn't respond. My breathing was shallow and my heart rate increased rapidly. The inability to move lasted long enough for me to become aware of it, though I cannot accurately estimate the duration. Eventually, though, I regained control abruptly, and as soon as I did, I left the room without looking back. To reach my parents' bedroom, I had to cross the living area, which faced a balcony enclosed by sliding glass panels. The apartment was several floors above ground level, and the balcony overlooked a neighboring complex. While moving through the living room, I noticed movement outside of the glass. A human-shaped silhouette appeared to be positioned on the balcony, upright and stationary. Then, as I moved, the shape appeared to move in the same direction, matching my pace, separated only by the glass. Well, I didn't stop to assess it, and I entered my parents' room and stayed there until morning. Thankfully, no further incidents occurred that night, and I eventually got a little bit of sleep. At the time, I didn't discuss the details with anyone. The stress of exams continued, and the event gradually receded into the background. Several months later, though, after we had relocated to a different part of the city, the subject came up indirectly during a conversation with my dad, and he mentioned that, on multiple occasions, he had mistaken reflections or shadows on the balcony glass for a person when returning home late at night. He attributed it to just being tired and the way the external lights reflected off the glass at certain angles. He said that he had noticed it more often during the periods of heavy rain or high humidity, and hearing that, well, it was less than reassuring. Out of curiosity, I later learned that the building had been constructed on land that previously held older residential structures and dense vegetation, which had been cleared shortly before development. There was no record of incidents associated with the site, but the construction quality was known to be a bit inconsistent, particularly regarding lighting placement and window alignment, allegedly anyway. I have never experienced anything similar since then, too, despite living in multiple other apartments. The incident has stuck with me all of these years too, not because of what I experienced, but more so because of what my father said. My own experience could be dismissed as maybe I was just tired or seeing things, or maybe it was sleep paralysis or something. But the fact that my father saw something too, well, that has always confused me and always makes me think that maybe there was something more to it. I generally approach unusual experiences with skepticism. In situations where people often reach for supernatural explanations, I default to environmental factors, stress responses, or maybe perceptual errors. That framework is important context for what follows too, because the incident itself was brief, mundane in structure, and also unsettling, only because of how sharply it conflicted with my expectations. So, I was living in Nevada when this happened. The area was pretty urban, surrounded by parking structures. There were some arterial roads and closely packed buildings nearby. Wildlife sightings were pretty uncommon, but not totally unheard of, particularly at night. I lived with a partner at the time, and we owned 2 indoor cats with well-established routines. Now, at about 3:45 in the morning, I was awakened by a repeated animal sound coming from outside. It was sustained, rhythmic, and loud enough to cut through the closed windows. Based on the length and the cadence, it sounded like a cat, and it didn't match the behavior of either of our pets, both of whom I confirmed were present and calm at the time. After determining the sound was external, I traced it to the patio directly beneath our unit. From the window, I could see that the neighboring porch light was on. The sound continued at regular intervals, suggesting an animal either distressed or attempting to attract attention or something like that. In any case, I went downstairs to check the area. The decision was practical rather than impulsive, I guess. My assumption was that an outdoor animal was either trapped or injured, and I should probably help it. On the lower patio, I observed a white, short-haired cat seated near the wall. Its posture was upright but rigid, and at first it didn't respond to movement, noise, or proximity. I attempted common methods to get its attention, including vocal cues and placing food nearby. There was no immediate reaction, no head movement, ear rotation, or visible focus shift. Even when objects landed within close range, it didn't move. This lack of response was notable, but not unprecedented in sick or severely stressed animals, I thought. After several seconds, the cat slowly rotated its head in my direction. The movement was delayed and sort of uneven, while the rest of the body remained stationary. When its face became visible, I instantly was shocked. The eyes appeared less like cat's eyes, and they were completely human. The coloration was light and the pupil shape didn't immediately register as a cat. The gaze was steady and forward-facing in a way that felt incongruent with the body language of the cat. I only looked at it for a moment, but it was sufficient enough to completely creep me out. The animal vocalized once more, but this time the sound was way lower and rougher than before, and didn't match the earlier pattern. At that point, I disengaged and I returned to my unit. Once inside, I locked the door and closed the blinds. I was now shaking and my heart was racing, and I had never seen anything like that. Now, I know that some people may not believe me, and they might say that maybe I just saw a reflection in the eyes, or maybe it was a distorted view through the glass or something like that. But I can assure you that this thing, whatever it was not a cat. It didn't sound like it at the end, and its eyes were completely human. Thankfully, I never did see it again after that, and it never seemed to come back, but I was on edge for weeks afterwards because the whole thing was just unbelievably creepy. I am generally cautious about how I interpret unusual memories from childhood. Developmental factors, incomplete recall, and the way that fear organizes memory all matter. I know that. That said, there are two incidents from different periods of my childhood that I've just never been able to fully reconcile, even after revisiting them as an adult. The first occurred when I was 8 years old and living in central Pennsylvania. The house was built in the early 1900s and had been renovated multiple times. It was not treated as unusual within the family, and there was no known history that suggested anything out of the ordinary. At that age, I was pretty anxious as a kid, but not prone to night terrors, sleepwalking, or vivid reoccurring dreams or anything. Now, the layout is pretty relevant too, so let me explain some things. My bedroom was at the end of a narrow hallway, and directly across from it was a small bathroom. My parents' bedroom was adjacent to mine, and my younger brother's room was at the opposite end. I habitually slept with my door open because I found closed doors more distressing at the time. And one night, I woke up during the night to the sound of the bathroom toilet flushing. This alone was not alarming, obviously. I assumed that one of my parents had gotten up. From my bed, I had a clear view of the hallway, and instead of one of my parents, I saw a person step out of the bathroom. It appeared to be a young female, taller than me, wearing a plain light-colored nightdress. She didn't look at me. She walked several steps down the hall, stopped, and turned to face the wall. She remained standing there, breathing loudly and irregularly. What stands out is not the panic, but the confusion that I felt too. I got out of bed and approached her slowly, expecting some acknowledgement, but there was none. The breathing continued without change, and I stood close enough to reach her. I raised my hand, but didn't make contact. At that point, fear suddenly registered, not because of how she looked, but because of the lack of reaction that she had. I instantly left the hallway and went into my parents' room. I woke my mother and told her, and my brother was standing at the hall, and that was the only explanation that made sense to me at the time, and she immediately checked on him. He was asleep in his bed. We then checked the bathroom and the hallway, but there was no one there. The house was searched, but nothing was found. No doors or windows were open. My mother did not attempt to explain what I had seen, and the event was just never really discussed again. As an adult, I consider several possibilities. Maybe it was partial dreaming, or memory consolidation errors, or something like that. But the difficulty I'm having with that is that my mother remembers the story too, which means that it's far less likely that I imagine things or that I'm just misremembering something. The second incident occurred roughly 3 years later, though, when I was about 11, in the same house. By then we had more technology in the home, and I had been given a basic digital music player with a camera function. I kept it charging on the shelf near my bed at night, and while showing some photos to a relative during a family visit, I noticed two images that I'm pretty sure I didn't take. One was a blurred image timestamped at around 4 in the morning. The other was taken less than a minute later, and it showed me asleep in my own bed, photographed from above at a downward angle. Both my arms were under the covers, mind you. The height of the angle suggested that the device had been held well above the mattress level. I did not immediately tell an adult, and instead I just deleted the images because they freaked me out so much. At the time, that decision was driven by avoidance rather than logic, I think, and I just didn't want an explanation that would escalate into fear or confrontation with whatever this was. Years later, though, I confronted my parents about whether or not they had taken the photos, but they assured me that they hadn't. My sibling was significantly shorter than the apparent camera height too, so really that was sort of impossible. Accidental activation is possible, I suppose, but I don't know. The angle and how high up it was just doesn't make any sense. In the end, I had no explanation for it, and so it's just one of those uneasy memories that now sits with me. In late summer of 2019, two friends and I were driving through eastern Kentucky as a part of a longer road trip. One of them suggested stopping near an old, decommissioned correctional facility outside of a small town in the Appalachian foothills. It was a former state prison that had been closed for years, and occasionally opened for historical tours as well. We had checked online beforehand and understood that the grounds were generally accessible during the day, even when the building itself was closed. When we arrived in the afternoon, the site was pretty quiet. The prison sat at the base of a steep wooded ridge with a narrow access road leading up to a fenced perimeter. There were no staff vehicles marked, no signage indicating closure, and no visitors besides us. We parked in a gravel area and walked toward the main yard entrance. Thankfully, too, one of the perimeter gates was unlocked and partially open. Inside the yard, we saw two adult men and a large dog. They were throwing something for the dog and appeared pretty relaxed. We didn't approach them directly, and after a few minutes, the dog wandered toward us. One of the men followed and began asking some questions. He didn't introduce himself, mind you. He did not ask where we were from. He just asked why we were there and whether we were part of a scheduled group. When we said that we were just stopping to look around a little bit, he said that we were not supposed to be inside the yard and that he was working for the property owner. He didn't say what work he was actually doing. He didn't explain why the gate was open either, and his tone shifted quickly from neutral to firm at this point. We left the yard without arguing too much, and we walked back toward the parking area. We assumed it was a misunderstanding. A few minutes later, a white SUV drove in quickly and stopped near us. A woman got out with a child still inside of the vehicle. She immediately told us that we needed to leave and referenced the man who we had spoken to. She followed us as we exited and manually closed and latched the gate behind us too. Once we were back outside of the fences, we checked again to confirm access rules. Nothing indicated that we were trespassing. And at that point, it felt less like an official issue and more like people discouraging others from being present for whatever reason. Well, after dark we decided to return, not to enter the building, but to park into the outer lot and just observe a little bit. We arrived at around 10:30 p.m. and we turned off the engine. From the road, we saw a pickup truck slowly driving up and down the access road without headlights. It passed, turned around and came back, and it never approached us. We debated our options, and we decided to walk along the tree line instead of driving in directly. As we moved uphill, staying out of the lights, we noticed a powerful beam occasionally sweeping upward from the prison grounds, illuminating the clouds, it seemed. It did not move like a fixed spotlight though, and it didn't follow a pattern either. Shortly after that, we heard an engine sound that resembled a dirt bike or maybe a small ATV somewhere beyond the lot. It stopped abruptly though. A few minutes later, we heard yelling. It was distant and irregular, not conversational at all, and we couldn't tell the source or the direction with certainty, but we paused, listened, and we didn't respond. While we were standing there, we realized that we were not alone. A large wild hog was several yards away, partially obscured by brush, and it shifted and started moving toward us. One of my friends recognized the behavior immediately and pulled us back without any hesitation. We retreated quickly and we returned to the car. At that point, we assumed that the area was pretty active and whatever was happening had nothing to do with us. So we drove back using the main road, and near the entrance we saw the same pickup parked off the side, and a man was operating a chainsaw near the tree line. The child from earlier was in the truck bed, aiming a flashlight straight up into the sky. The woman was standing near her SUV watching the road. She pulled out and blocked our path, and she threatened to call law enforcement and claimed that she was authorized to control access. When asked for clarification or contact information, she refused and repeated that we needed to leave immediately. And it was at this point that we heard a gunshot and somebody scream, and everybody who was present went immediately still. Well, I wasn't about to wait around to find out what that was all about. I quickly put the vehicle into gear and we sped out of there, and we never looked back. Once we were several miles away, we contacted the police to let them know what had happened. They told us that we actually had not broken any laws, but advised us not to go back that night, and suggested that the situation might involve private activity unrelated to the prison itself, and that they would go and check it out. We never did hear back from the police, and I don't really know what was going on there, but something suspicious was happening, and that gunshot and the scream, well, whatever that was, it couldn't have been good. In late 2019, my family moved into a different house within the same outer suburb of Brisbane. The move was pretty short distance, less than a kilometre in fact, but motivated by space rather than finances. The property itself was structurally sound, but unfinished in several respects. Some fittings were pretty outdated, and there was no installed alarm system too. That stood out to us, but at the time we treated it as a bit of an oversight rather than a risk. Now, our first night there followed a pretty normal routine. My wife and I slept in the main bedroom upstairs. Our two children, ages 4 and 6, were in separate rooms along the same hallway. But it was around shortly after midnight that I was woken by my younger son entering our bedroom. He was sort of half asleep and told me that he could hear thumping downstairs. I assumed it was the house settling or maybe an external noise and told him to climb into our bed. With the space pretty limited, I moved to his room and I ended up laying down there instead. And within a minute or two, I heard the same noise that he had described. It was irregular and mechanical, not rhythmic. It didn't sound like footsteps inside the house or anything, but I got out of bed anyway and walked down the stairwell to identify the source. At the top of the stairs was a narrow window that overlooked the side of the house. From that angle, you could see the external laundry door that led directly into the kitchen. I looked down and I immediately noticed several people standing close to the door. There were 4, possibly 5 individuals, I would say. They were wearing dark jackets and face coverings consistent with balaclavas. Each of them was holding a phone with the flashlight activated, aimed at the door's hardware. One person was physically manipulating the handle with force, and the noise my son and I had heard was metal being stressed. It took a brief moment to process that this was not a misunderstanding. There was no attempt at concealment beyond the masks, and they were not reacting as if they expected to be challenged. I opened the window and spoke to them. I didn't shout. I said something to the effect of telling them to leave and that the house was now occupied. The wording was blunt, but my tone was controlled. All of them looked up at once, and none of them ran. There was no verbal response, in fact. They disengaged from the door and they walked away together at a normal pace, exiting down the side path and out of sight. I closed the window and immediately woke up my wife. We called the police and stayed awake for the remainder of the night, but thankfully no one returned. The following morning, officers attended the property and they confirmed that multiple houses in the surrounding streets that they had been targeted the same night. Our door handle was visibly damaged and nearly detached, in fact. The assessment was that entry would likely have occurred within seconds, in fact, if the attempt had continued. That same day, we installed some new locks, exterior lighting, and monitored alarm systems. The police did not identify the individuals involved, and there were no arrests linked to our specific incident. Although nothing further occurred, the event certainly affected how I perceived the house from that point on. The proximity to our previous home, it didn't provide any comfort too, and the sense that the break-in attempt happened immediately on the first night altered just how secure the space felt. We remained there for some time, but the initial confidence never really fully returned. Several months later, during renovations, we found a small quantity of illegal drugs wrapped and concealed inside of a drawer that had definitely belonged to the previous occupants. We did report it, and it was collected without any issue. There was no confirmed connection to the attempted break-in, but it reinforced the impression that the property, it had a history that we were definitely unaware of. The critical factor to all of this was timing, though. If my son had not been disturbed, I would not have changed rooms, and if I had not moved, I would not have heard the noise clearly enough to investigate. The response of the group, leaving calmly when addressed like that, was unusual too, but I suppose it's consistent with offenders who prefer avoidance over confrontation. Thankfully, we escaped that night unscathed, but it's a night that I will never forget. In mid-2016, I was 13 years old and living in a regional city in eastern Scotland. One of my friends, who had just turned 16, was spending the afternoon at my house. Her name was Claire. My father was away overnight for work and no other adults were present. We were sort of bored and decided to walk to a small discount store Claire had not visited before. We assumed it would still be open, despite it being very early evening. The store was several kilometers away. The most direct route involved cutting through a public woodland that bordered a housing estate. I had used that path frequently when I was younger, always during the day and usually with family. Because of that familiarity as well, I did not assess it as risky at all. We left the house shortly after 6:30. It was still light, though the sun was pretty low. The path through the trees was quiet. The only people that I had ever seen there before were dog walkers or joggers, typically older residents from nearby streets. About halfway through the wooded section, I noticed an adult male standing just off the main path. He was wearing a hooded jacket and appeared to be smoking. He was stationary and not doing anything overt, but his presence felt sort of out of place given the time and the location. I pointed him out quietly to Claire. Without discussing it, we adjusted our path to pass him at a distance. I'm fairly sure that he saw us. There was no verbal exchange, and he didn't follow at that moment. So we exited the wooded area and continued toward the shop. Unfortunately for us, though, by the time that we arrived, it was closed. The shutters were down and the lights were off, and we didn't wait around and immediately turned back, planning to retrace the same route home. At that point, we were pretty relaxed again. We talked normally and didn't mention the man. Roughly 10 minutes into the return walk, I noticed someone ahead of us on the path, though. Based on his clothing and build, I believed that it was the same individual from earlier. I stopped walking. Claire noticed and followed my line of sight. Without saying anything, She grabbed my arm and pulled me off the path into a side area that I didn't recognize. We moved quickly and circled back to the main route, assuming that changing direction would be enough. When we looked behind us, the man was now running toward us, though. He was no longer walking or lingering. He was moving at full speed and had clearly changed behavior. Claire immediately took control of the situation. She pulled me forward and began running, asking which direction led home. One option was back toward the wooded area, but now much darker. The other led deeper into an unfamiliar residential zone, so we chose the second option without stopping to think it through. We ran until we saw an adult woman standing near a parked car, talking on her phone. We went directly to her and told her that we were being followed and asked if we could stand with her. She didn't engage beyond briefly acknowledging us, but she didn't ask any questions or confront anyone either. However, after that point, the man was no longer visible. Neither of our phones were usable, and Claire's phone had no battery. Mine had signal, but no mobile data, and so I couldn't load any maps. I had a general sense of where we were, but not a clear route back, that was for sure. We walked slowly, choosing streets based on recognition rather than certainty, and eventually I identified a landmark that confirmed our direction. We still had to pass back through the part of the wooded area to get home, but by then it was fully dark. I used my phone torch while we walked. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't hear or see anyone else, and we reached the house eventually without any further incident. We didn't tell anyone when we got back that night. We had left the house without permission after all, and we both understood that explaining the situation would raise questions that we didn't want to answer at the time. And for a long time, it remained pretty much unspoken between us. Several months later, though, I watched a local true crime video online covering a violent offense committed by a teenager in the same district. The footage, it included the streets and the paths that I recognized immediately, including the area where we had been chased. That prompted me to mention the incident to my mother, and only then did she tell me that that area had a long-standing reputation for assaults and harassment, particularly after dark. I am grateful that Claire was there that day, because if she wasn't, well, I shudder to think what might have happened. So the other night I was walking my dog in a managed public woodland outside of a mid-sized town where I live. The area connects several residential zones, and it's routinely used by commuters, runners, and dog owners all the time. I walk there multiple times a week, in fact, and am pretty familiar with the main and secondary paths there too. Now, the incident occurred shortly after 6 o'clock. Sunset had already passed, and while there was residual ambient light around, the forest floor was pretty dark. I had just crossed a pedestrian underpass beneath a regional highway and entered a narrow descending footpath that leads toward housing on the opposite side. The path curves left with dense shrub growth on both sides. Visibility beyond approximately 20 to 25 meters is pretty limited, particularly in low light. As I began descending, my dog stopped abruptly several meters ahead of me. This was pretty unusual for her. She wears a small LED tag on her collar, and when she stopped, the light briefly illuminated a person standing at the lowest point of the dip in the path. The individual was positioned directly in the center of the walkway. They were stationary and facing uphill toward me. On the ground in front of them was a large wheeled travel bag that appeared old and damaged. The handle was extended, and the bag partially blocked the path at this point. At that moment, I assessed that turning back would involve retracing the underpass and moving away from the nearest residential exit. I also considered that a sudden retreat could provoke pursuit. I chose instead to continue forward at a steady pace without changing my body language. As I closed the distance, the person's height, it became more apparent due to the slope and the lack of reference points that they were pretty tall. In fact, they were significantly taller than average, and wearing a long, dark outer garment that obscured their body shape and extended right down to their ankles. The garment had a hood that covered most of their head. I did not use my torch at this stage, as I wanted to avoid escalating the situation as much as possible. I was carrying a high output torch, my dog's lead with a metal clasp as well, and a steel water bottle. I mentally rehearsed using the torch to create a brief visual advantage if I needed to pass at close range. When I reached a point where avoidance was no longer possible, I activated the torch directly towards the individual's upper body and face and moved to pass on their right. They responded verbally in a low, controlled voice, saying something to the effect of warning me against doing that. And that very brief illumination revealed something that I will never forget. The face was thin, way too thin, and completely white. Their hair, or what was of it, was thin and scraggly. Their eyes were quite large too, and almost completely black. Well, as you can imagine, I accelerated uphill upon seeing them pass them and immediately diverted off the main path into a steeper wooded section with uneven ground. I recalled my dog, switched off both her collar light and my torch, and changed direction twice to break line of sight. I then stopped briefly in cover to listen for a little bit. For a short period, I heard movement consistent with someone moving through undergrowth, footsteps, labored breathing, and branches breaking. But the sounds, they didn't close the distance, and they eventually seemed to cease. After waiting, I continued toward the nearest residential area using indirect routes. I reached my home and instantly locked my door, and I really didn't sleep well that night. In the early 2000s, I lived for a short period with my grandfather outside of a rural township in northern Ontario. The settlement itself was pretty small, but our residence was several miles beyond it, accessible only by unmarked forestry road. The cabin, it was self-built, off-grid, and pretty isolated. There were no neighboring properties within walking distance, and traffic on the access road was rare outside of hunting season. At the time, I was in school, and the cabin had a single bedroom which my grandfather used. I slept in the main living area, and due to the layout, my bed was placed against a large front-facing window. During daylight hours, the window overlooked the clearing, vehicles, and the equipment stored outside, and after sunset, visibility practically dropped to zero out there. There was no exterior lighting whatsoever. Now, one evening, following the usual routine, after dinner, my grandfather sat in the chair near the wood stove reading while I went to bed. He often stayed awake until I fell asleep, and I don't recall anything unusual about that night before I went to sleep, but several hours later, I woke up due to discomfort and shifted position in bed. This placed my face towards the window rather than away from it, and as my eyes adjusted, I became aware of a shape directly outside the glass. The distance was close enough that it couldn't have been more than a few inches from the window. Initially, I assumed it was a visual error, caused by darkness and fatigue. I remained still and focused on the outline. As my vision adjusted further, I could make out the head and shoulders of an adult male. He was stationary and facing inward. There was no attempt to conceal himself and no sound. After several seconds, the person bent down until his face aligned with mine through the glass, and at that point, I reacted by crying loudly and uncontrollably. The noise, it woke my grandfather. As soon as my grandfather stood up and moved toward the living area too, the individual outside retreated. I didn't hear any footsteps, but the figure disappeared immediately. My grandfather approached me and asked what had happened. I described what I saw, and he didn't question my account. He turned on all the interior lights, retrieved a firearm from his bedroom, and went outside to check the perimeter. He remained outside for several minutes, walking the clearing and checking the access road. When he returned, his behavior was noticeably different too. He didn't dismiss the incident, and he didn't reassure me in a casual way either. Instead, he stayed awake for the rest of the night, seated where he could see the door, and allowed me to remain awake as well. The following morning, he covered the windows with curtains and repositioned my bed away from the exterior walls. When daylight came, he inspected the ground around the cabin and found shoe impressions in the soil right near the front window leading toward the tree line. And so, in the days that followed, my routine changed. I was no longer allowed outside alone, and movement around the property was pretty much restricted. And about a week later, a local news report stated that a man had escaped from a regional correctional facility and had been located in the same forested area. He had been using unoccupied structures and hunting shelters for cover, and one of the access points mentioned matched the road leading to our cabin. What was particularly troubling, though, was what this guy was in for. Apparently, he was a murderer and had assaulted people before many times. He was a really bad person, this guy. And so, to come face to face with someone like this is something that is difficult to forget. I started this back in September last year, but I never got around to sharing it. I am now, though, due to an uncomfortable situation again. So, I have to get some context out of the way first. Let me start off by saying that I live in an apartment complex by a golf course or country club on the edge of town. Since not many people live in this area, it can get pretty quiet at night too. The complex is built partially into a small hill at the end of the road, with my apartment being on the back corner of the building on the ground floor. So the bottom of the windows in the living room and both bedrooms start literally a few inches above the ground outside. There is a sort of small trail behind my apartment building that goes through a small wooded patch. I don't have much of a view since my living room windows face a good 15 to 20 foot patch of grass before a tree line separating it from a few houses on the next street over. But this story, it has been ongoing for the last couple of months. I'm not entirely sure if this is just paranoia or coincidental too. Last summer, a family moved into a house on the next street over, a couple of houses down from my apartment. I've only seen one middle-aged man and a dog so far, but I was taking my Shih Tzu Harley outside one day while he was out in his backyard just standing with his arms crossed, swaying side to side. It was sort of like an NPC character in 2000s video games waiting to be interacted with. The dumpster shed area is in view of his backyard too. We made eye contact, so I sort of awkwardly waved and then just looked at my phone while Harley did her business. But I could tell from my peripheral vision that he didn't look away from us. We have the same breed of dogs, so I just assumed that he was probably thinking of letting them meet sometime. But I wondered why he didn't have his dog outside with him at this moment. In the end, I just went back inside quickly after Harley was done. Now, my younger brother lives in the same complex as I do, but on the second floor, and he told me that every now and then, he'd see that man take his dog out into his backyard, but cross the tree line into the complex yard. He would circle the building slowly, a little too close to the building before going back into his house. In September of last year, my boyfriend at the time and I split up. The night that I told him to leave, I went to a friend's house to vent. I didn't want to leave Harley home alone too long, so after about an hour or so, I came back to my apartment. I knocked out on the couch while I had a black screen rain sound video on YouTube on. I woke up at around 2 a.m. to Harley going absolutely crazy though, barking and growling. The other couch is right under the main window in my living room. Harley had climbed up the couch and was barking at the window between the curtains. I get up to get her down and to be quiet when my stomach dropped when I realized something. The curtains are on the thinner side and I can normally faintly see the streetlights from the next street over through the curtains. I started getting a little bit nervous, realizing that there was a black mass blocking some of the lights above where Harley was standing. I grabbed the remote to shut the TV off while I was getting closer to the window. The TV turns off in the sort of style of retro TVs where the picture sort of closes in on itself. When I turned it off, the flash animation on the TV illuminated the room briefly, and it was enough that I was able to make out the form of someone dressed in black or dark clothes, crouched down, looking into my window. In the flash, they probably saw me too, because they ran away quickly. I picked up Harley and ran to the kitchen to grab a knife, and went to my room and I locked the door. I texted my ex asking if he was outside of the window just then, and he replied no and asked what was happening. I didn't believe him though, because he's never awake that late, and told him that I was about to call the police, so to just tell me the truth and all that. But he told me that I should call them either way, and sent me his live location showing that he was at his friend's house over an hour away. I called the police and let them know that I had seen someone outside of my window. They came and looked around, finding nothing obviously. An officer did tell me though that they would keep somebody in the area, so to just call back if anything else happened. Over the next couple of weeks around the same time, 2 or 3 a.m. each night, Harley would freak out at the window. By the time that I would get there, I couldn't see anyone outside though. Fast forward now to May of 2024. This last week I went through my storage closet and found some of my ex's things. I was out with some friends tonight when he came to pick them up. He ended up texting me to come home so that we could talk about something important. I get home and I notice that he has a sort of puzzled look on his face. I asked what couldn't have been just texted to me, and he told me that while he was loading his stuff in his truck, he took Harley out quick, and he was approached by an older lady that lives on the second floor. Now, the dumpster is at the end of the parking lot, and if you turn right, you'll face the side of the building in the general area, outside of my living room window. There's a few big trees keeping the area back there pretty dark. Even during the summer, it's pretty much deeply shaded. And she said that as she was taking her trash out, she heard a twig snap or something like that, and looked in the direction that it came from. She said that she saw a man outside of my window, not just walking around. He was up close, peering into my living room, one hand up on the window trying to block the light so that he could see, and his phone in the other hand pointing inside of my apartment. She yelled out asking him what the heck he was doing, but he just acted like he didn't hear her and walked away slowly in the opposite direction. She said that it would have been one thing if he was just walking through the yard and sort of glanced over at my window, but he was apparently full on pressing his face against the glass looking in and recording allegedly. My blood instantly ran cold and I got goosebumps. I have since then bought a Ring camera, which is honestly something I should have done a long time ago, but I'll update if anything else happens, so please, do wish me luck. Today I was listening to some scary stories, and it made me remember this event. At the time of this story, I was 14, and as well as being younger, I had developed crippling anxiety and depression. All I'll say is that I was, and still am, very vigilant about my surroundings. Now on this day, I had planned to stay the night at a friend's house. I had never stayed at her place before. It was always mine. For you to understand this story, I do need to explain the layout of this house. It was located on a sloped hill, and when you drove down a steep road, the first part of the house you would see was big and expansive. Honestly, it looked a bit like an old mansion. If you continue driving down, you would be met with 2 semi-separated buildings. Both were small and pretty run down. And when I say small, I mean one of them was just a bedroom and the other one was a bedroom and a small bathroom and kitchen. There were no doors inside, just a piece of cloth or beads to separate the bathroom entrance from the kitchen. My friend's room was the bedroom, and her mum lived in the other section with the bathroom or kitchen. The landlord of the property lived in the main house, the big mansion. It was located in the middle of the woods, and when I say that, I don't mean it lightly. I mean, all you could see was expansive Australian forest. Australian rainforests are incredibly dense too, and if you tried to walk through, you would most likely receive some type of bite at some point, whether that be a spider, an ant, a leech, etc. So, I'll cut to the first thing that happened. Me and my friend, we had walked into her mum's flat. I forget why, but I think we were either hungry or I was asking how to get reception, because there was none at the time, and called out for her mum. She was in the bathroom, and as we walked past a small window, I heard, "Yeah?" coming from outside. I turned to my friend, and she looked at me the same way that I did. We were really confused. If her mum was in the bathroom, that was right in front of us. Why did we hear a male voice coming from right outside? We brushed this off so as not to scare ourselves and continued having fun in my friend's room. For a little more context, the landlord used half of her room as storage and blocked off the back section of the room with a tall shelf and a divider. There was a huge glass sliding door at the front of her room too, and in the blocked off back section there was another door. You couldn't get to that door unless you squeezed through a section outside. Now, skipping forward a little bit to nighttime, me and my friend had to go to the bathroom, so we slinked out of her room and walked to her mum's flat. Her mum was fast asleep now. We used the bathroom as quietly as we could, and then we exited. As we were making the small walk back to my friend's room, we saw something out in the woods. A pair of eyes, looking directly at us from behind a tree. We panicked and froze. I pulled out my phone and took a photo before we sprinted back into her room, locking the glass door behind us and drawing the curtains. It's not a reach to say that we were already freaking out. We looked at the photo and, sure enough, when I brightened the image, there was what looked to be a man staring at us from the dark woods. Obviously, we were extremely scared, but I called my mother, who was about an hour away, and she just sort of dismissed us. And so after that, we were obviously scared, but it was a little comforting. Anyway, after a while we relaxed and chalked it up to our imagination playing tricks on us. We pulled out my laptop and put on a movie. I forget which movie we watched, but it was some cheesy rom-com, I think. And maybe 20 or 30 minutes into the movie, we froze and paused it. There were footsteps crunching on the dry leaves right outside of her room. We listened in horror as the footsteps moved through the tight alley that led to the back door. We both moved slowly, standing on the bed to look over the room divider. Our eyes were locked on the back door, and after a moment of complete silence, it turned. The doorknob wiggled slowly before it became faster. The door couldn't be opened as it was jammed against objects that were in storage, and then it stopped. No more noise. We were crying, holding each other in our arms, trying to stay as quiet as we could. Then the footsteps slowly crunched on the leaves in the opposite direction, back to the front of her room. We both didn't hesitate now, and I reached for my phone. We called the police, and after trying to explain the situation to the operator on the other end, in tears the whole time, she told us a unit was being dispatched and to stay where we were. But then, as we were still crying and hyperventilating, we heard a phone ringing. It sounded like an old landline phone, one with harsh and loud beeping. It was coming from the landlord's mansion. We waited silently, listening to the drawn-out ringing of his phone. After what felt like at least 2 minutes, it stopped, and we heard his voice as he talked to the operator. At this time, we both noticed another thing: fingerprints on her window. These windows were slated glass that you could open and shut with a lever. Whoever left these prints, they reached up, cupped their hand around the top of the glass, and dragged their fingers on the dust, because it definitely wasn't there before. Soon, the landlord walked to her mother's unit and had told her that the police called him. He seemed extremely upset and told her that he made sure that they didn't send a unit. Her mother came to her room and we explained the situation. Both the landlord and her mother didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that a man just tried to enter our room. After that, I couldn't stay the night, and neither could my friend. We were too scared to spend another minute there, so I called my mum and she came to get us at around 11 p.m. to 12 p.m. We dropped my friend back the next day, and when we got there, her mother told us something that I don't think that I can pass up as coincidence. You see, the night that it happened, it was raining, and there was a pretty strong wind, but nothing strong enough to do this. Next to her mother's unit, she had a pole that held beads and fairy lights and all that. During the night, right after me and her were picked up, it had been knocked down. Keep in mind, this pole was literally embedded into the cement and tied to other items with zip ties as well. So like I said, there was no way that could have been the wind. I mean, that pole is pretty darn sturdy. I am still unsure of an explanation to all of this. I mean, it may have been her landlord, right? I'm not too sure about that. It also could have been just a random man. Either way, I'm absolutely certain that there was somebody out there that night. I'm a 25-year-old person renting a 4-bedroom house. One of my roommates is my boyfriend, and the other is my best friend of 10 years. Her name is Tracy. We've been looking for a new roommate, and because of the way that this situation turned out, we have determined that I'm no longer allowed to be in charge of looking for roommates, because I am not judgmental enough and I am known to just ignore red flags. I'll start from the beginning though, which is the house showing. So, our new prospective roommate showed up for the house showing and introduced himself. He definitely seemed strange at first, but I wrote it off as him just sort of being eccentric. The main red flag was that, at some point, he randomly said something to the effect of, "And I will not bring meth into your house because I'm not on meth. I hate drugs and I see them as a scourge on this entire country." I didn't ask, so I was immediately weirded out, but my boyfriend and the roommate who was moving out also met the guy, and they both thought that apart from that, he seemed pretty normal. He didn't look like a stereotypical meth head by any means. His skin was clear, and he was kind of chubby. We thought that maybe he thought I was a meth head, because I look a little bit scary. I have green hair, a 1G septum, and 6 facial piercings. In addition, my roommate, who was moving out, turned out to be hiding a cat, which made the house stink like cat wee, which I've been told is what meth smells like. Also, the town that this guy was coming from is known for meth and crack, and he seemed to be explicitly trying to get away from that town. So I thought that maybe he was afraid of ending up in a situation where he was living with drug addicts and was trying to suss us out that way. And so, giving him the benefit of the doubt was my first mistake. Me and Tracy, we were both sort of wigged out about the entire thing, but we were kind of desperate for a roommate, and all of the other people responding to my listing either were not great fits or were even sketchier than this guy. So in the end, we let him move in. Now, skip to the move-in date. He brings an old man to help move his stuff. He then proceeds to make the old man move all of his things by himself up the stairs while he sits there, including a refrigerator, by himself. The new guy signs the lease, and immediately after signing the lease, he informs us that he did not introduce himself using his real name, and proceeds to tell us his real name. This man was not transgender, so the only reason that I can think of as for why he initially gave us a fake name is probably so that he could avoid having us run a background check. After this, I had to go to work though. Throughout my shift though, Tracy sends me a message that the guy is weird, but her responses are sort of vague and I didn't find out what happened until I got home. But here's what she told me. So the new guy, he goes to the bar after signing the lease and comes back after being kicked out before 9 p.m. The bar that he went to is a biker bar that is notorious for being pretty rowdy. Honestly, it's pretty hard to get kicked out of there too. I mean, you pretty much have to be doing something pretty heinous, or you have to have been like creeping on a woman there in order to get kicked out. In any case, when he comes back, he is completely drunk, but the men there must have been intimidated by me, is what he said. Sounds to me more like he was creeping. Before this, I had told the new guy that our landlord is coming up the next day to fix some things in the house. But when the new guy came home, Tracy reminded him that our landlord was coming the next day, and he became extremely angry, to the point that he was flailing his arms and she thought that he was going to start breaking things. Tracy was so uncomfortable that she almost went to go and wake up my boyfriend in the other room. Eventually, the new guy did calm down, however, and so she just left it at that. Now, there's this beanbag that we have next to my couch, and Tracy was sitting on the beanbag with her legs sort of slung over the armrest of the couch. At first, the new guy sat on the couch. He begins to read off poetry that he wrote for her an entire hour and a half before, all of which is literally just streams of consciousness about how he wants all junkies to die. Afterwards, he starts telling her how beautiful she is over and over, and literally lays his head down between her legs. She's trying to ignore him and obviously trying to get him off her, and he won't stop asking her if she fell asleep. Every time she moves, he gets a little bit closer. Then he starts inviting her to his room for a beer. Eventually, she just gets up and goes to her room at 11 p.m. But this man, he had effectively harassed her for like 2 entire hours. I thought that was everything, but then she tells me that she sent the guy's picture to her mum, who then sent his picture to everyone she knows, because she's from the town that he was previously living in. And it turned out that he had been stalking Tracy's aunt for an entire year, and that he's banned from the bar that she works at because he goes there and threatens to kidnap her. She literally has to be escorted out, not only by workers, but the customers escort her to her car sometimes. So, obviously we tell our landlord. Luckily our lease hadn't been finalized yet, so he agreed to kick him out. I call my mum to come over and Tracy calls her brother for backup, just in case things go south. Our landlord shows up and essentially tells him that he needs to leave and doesn't let the new guy get a word in. The new guy starts getting agitated though, and then aggressive, so we called the cops and several officers showed up, told the guy that he had no legal standing as there was no lease. He introduced himself to us with a fake name, obviously, and he hadn't been there for a full 24 hours and that he had to get out. The guy had to beg his sister to pick him up, and she was so unwilling to do it that she didn't agree until he offered to pay her $200. Mind you, it's only a 20-minute ride to where he was going. He left most of his stuff on our porch. When we went into his room, it smelled like cigarette smoke and there was an empty pack on the floor, including not 1 or 2, but 7 empty Dr. Pepper cans and garbage and crusty socks everywhere. The entire situation had me so stressed out that I didn't even notice that he had also left a pair of shorts that he had peed in the middle of the house's main hallway, and that was also the first thing you see when you walk into the house. They were there for the entire day, allegedly, even when he knew that the landlord was coming. They were still sitting there when he left as well, and I picked them up with a glove and put them on the porch for him to retrieve at some point. But who knows if or when he will retrieve his things, because he came back earlier, touched his things like he was going to take them, and then just immediately left. All I have to say after all of this is that I'm really relieved that we caught this before the lease was finalized, because this easily could have turned into a situation where me and Tracy had been sexually assaulted, or perhaps even worse. I've only told a few people about this incident that took place in the late 80s. I'm not looking for an explanation, nor can I offer any proof. I just want to share what my friend and I experienced in the autumn of 1987. So I grew up in one of the northernmost states in New England, about 2 hours away from the White Mountains and 45 minutes from our state's meager coastline, in a small working-class city. General Electric and a tannery were 2 of the largest employers. I think it was early October. The leaves started to change, but still on the trees, local fairs underway, and cool enough to rock my HS varsity jacket. I worked full-time and was saving up for my first car, a 76 two-door Chevy Nova festooned with a Pink Floyd tapestry to cover the huge tear in the back seat. My friend, Joe, and I worked in the same restaurant, and an older cook would buy us hard-earned libations and give us a ride home. Really, he would just drop us off at a cemetery that was midway point between our 2 houses, and a great place for underage drinking. We were dropped off there with a 4-pack of bottles and James wine coolers to split between us. It's an old large cemetery with rolling hills, moss-covered headstones, and large maple trees too. grew up playing hide and seek and having BB gun wars there, in fact. I even taught an army buddy how to drive stick in that cemetery. It was never a scary or haunted place to me at all. Even after the weirdest experience of my young life took place there, I still thought of it fondly. Now, there was a gazebo where we would sit and drink beers, wine coolers. It was open-aired with half walls and benches to sit on while we chatted and drank. All we had between us was that one 4-pack, so we were not drunk or under the influence of anything else. But we began hearing footsteps coming in our direction. They sounded like somebody was walking on leaves. It later occurred to me that that was the first thing that was odd, as the leaves were still on the trees and the cemetery was pretty well maintained. "Cops," Joe hissed, and I answered, "Kids." The footsteps, they came closer. We couched below the half wall facing each other, the smiles on our faces growing more and more nervous until they disappeared altogether. The footsteps came in a measured pace. No other sound accompanied them, no jingling of keys, no fabric brushing against each other, and there was also no beam of a flashlight flitting about. The footsteps kept coming though. I could see my mounting fear echoed in Joe's face, but before we crouched down, we tried to see who was walking toward us, and we really couldn't. But that was to be expected, to be honest. It was a moonless night with little ambient light available. With our eyes wide and mouths agape, the footsteps came all the way up to the other side of that half wall and stopped. Joe visibly sagged, and I began to shake as neither one of us had the courage to look up at what had to be surely someone peering down at us. The footsteps, they then began to recede, and we popped up immediately to see who it was. And when we did, there was nobody there. Literally nobody. I mean, we could hear or sort of see where the footsteps were coming from, but there just wasn't anybody making them. It was dark, but it wasn't pitch black, and we surely would have seen someone there. We definitely would have at least seen the silhouette of a person out there. Ducking behind tombstones, we followed the steps a little ways down the hill until they stopped. And at that, we took that as our cue to leave, and we both sprinted home. The next day at school, we allowed that it was weird, and, well, that was that. We didn't tell anyone, and we just sort of went on with our lives. Like I said, we weren't drunk or stoned. Neither of us have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and being outside like that, I seriously doubt it was a carbon monoxide problem. Really, I just have no explanation for this, and I don't expect anyone else to either. The 80s were a magical time, and I guess some days they just contained a little more magic than others. When I was in primary school, we used to go on school trips to a place called Marchants Hill in Surrey, UK. Marchants Hill is an adventure centre that mainly caters to schools. They have activities like climbing, orienteering, canoeing, etc., and they had dorms to stay in as well. We usually went for like 4 or 5 days. The place sits on 45 acres of land, and there's really no reason to be there other than the above. I believe they also have a part for adults for team building trips and stuff like that, but they're certainly not together, so we'd only ever see employees or sometimes kids from a different school while there. Now, one evening, we were camping out for the night. A Marchants Hill employee led us to the camping area at about 7 p.m, helped show us all how to set up our tents, and start a fire, and then left for the night, leaving us in the care of 2 of our teachers from school. We had a fire going, and we're all sitting around it on logs that were placed around the fire area. We were singing songs and talking and just being kids as it got darker. After a while, a couple of us heard the sound of somebody approaching, but I didn't think too much of it. Probably just an employee checking in. Suddenly, though, this guy appears out of the darkness and loudly says, "You shouldn't be here." Everyone whips their head around to see who it was, and this guy was just sort of standing there. He's a big guy, looked homeless in that he had a big scraggly beard and hair, but he's wearing a suit with Wellington boots and is holding a plastic bag. But one of our teachers says to the guy, "It's okay, we're booked in for a few days. We're from this school." The guy looks around for a few seconds, like he's checking behind himself, and then repeats, "You shouldn't be here," but louder. The male teacher that was with us jumps up and positions himself between the guy and us kids very quickly, and repeats that we are supposed to be here, and asks the man who he is, while at the same time grabbing him by the arm to sort of lead him away. The strange guy pulls his arm away aggressively, then walks off real quickly without saying another word though. A bit later, all of the kids are in their tents, two to a tent. The teachers are still sat outside, probably enjoying some child free time, when we hear some shouting, and it sounded to me like, "Go, go, get out." A few of us opened our tents, and I could just about see the same guy standing there in the darkness. Our teacher is already right by the guy at that point, and shouts at him to leave, but the guy is just sort of looking at him, so the teacher starts to gently push him back away from us, and is saying something to the guy while doing so. They disappear into the darkness of the surrounding area for maybe 30 seconds. Then my teacher comes back and, with a look of urgency, says, "We're going back to the dorms right now." No idea what was said, but my teacher's whole demeanor had changed suddenly. We all leave our tents pitched, and we walk the 10 minutes or so back to the dorms by torchlight. Once we're in the dorm, the teachers go off to speak to an employee, and about 15 minutes later, we see a police car pull up by the reception area, and the police talk to my teacher. That guy had absolutely no reason to be on that 45 acres of land. Looking back, he probably had mental health issues, but man did he scare us. And thinking back on it all, it still makes me feel a little bit uneasy. This happened a few years ago, so some details may not be the clearest in my head, but I'll try to recall this event in its fullest form. So first, let me set up the layout of where it happened. My upstairs hallway has 5 rooms connected to it. In order from the stairs, it goes my sister's room, the bathroom, the office, master bedroom, and then my room at the very end. The stairs lead down to the kitchen and share a wall with the bathroom, so you can hear anyone on the stairs quite easily. In addition to this, it's not a new house, so you can hear pretty much everything because thin walls, loud floors, and doors and all that. Now, what happened one night was that I had woken up at around midnight or 1 a.m. because I needed to go to the bathroom at some point. But with the standard amount of grumbling because I didn't want to leave the warmth of my bed, I got up and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. Everything was perfectly normal until I went to go and wash my hands. A sound on the stairs made me pause because it didn't sound like one of the cats. They're fat and old and have a very distinct way of going up and down the stairs. I listened though as quick, light footsteps ran up the stairs and around the corner to come down the hallway. They ran up and down the hallway twice before stopping in front of the bathroom door, which I couldn't have been more than 3 feet away from. They breathed loudly, in and out a few times. Then they ran back down the hall and down the steps into the kitchen where they stopped making noise. I would have been able to hear them if they continued. I was rightly freaked out because the sounds that I had heard were very clearly made from a little kid, of which there were none in my house. The footsteps were too close together, light, and way too quick to be anyone in the house messing with me. In order to move that fast, anyone who lived there would have had to have made at least twice as much noise, and the only one capable of running as fast as what I'd heard would have been my sister. But again, she couldn't have done it that quietly. I ended up waiting for about 2 hours in that bathroom before finally coming back out and booking it to my room. Any perpetrators would have been heard if they had tried to return to their room or if they were anywhere awake because our house is very quiet at night. But I heard nothing after that night. No footsteps, no breathing, no activity. The next morning too, I asked each of my family members individually and separately, so they couldn't talk to each other between my interrogations, if they had gotten up at all last night, or if they had heard anything last night too. None of them are good liars, and I know when they're telling the truth, so when they all said that they slept through the night, genuinely, I believe them. So we moved into this house 5.5 years ago. I'd never experienced anything paranormal before. Honestly, I was a hardcore skeptic. It was around 18 months later that I began to experience disturbing paranormal events I cannot explain, no matter how much science I read. Note too, I do not have a history of hallucinations or schizophrenia or anything. I wasn't smoking weed at the time, nor on any other drugs. I was also in my mid-20s at the time. The first incident was on a November night at about 10:50 p.m. Almost all events happened between 10:51 to 2 a.m., but primarily between 11 to 1. For some context, I'd spent the last hour playing Among Us and studying from a Spanish textbook. I would listen to relaxing jazz sometimes and drink some Jack Daniels. I wasn't drunk by any means, but I went to pee. My mind was focused on how clever, funny the games were and how I couldn't wait to get back to what I was doing. And when I pulled my trousers up, a noise caught my attention. It was an Alberta Balsam shampoo bottle, about 1/3 or just under full, between the taps on the sink. It is a standard British porcelain sink close to the toilet, but to touch the bottle, I would need to extend my arm, bending my elbow, and that night there was no one nowhere near close enough for contact. But the bottle, it rocked far to the left, to the right, unnaturally, and repeated this motion about 5 times before it came to a standstill in its original position. It wasn't a small wobble by any means too. It was a slow, intentional rock side to side. The bottle should not have been able to rock so far for either side either without falling over. But my bathroom is tiny. I couldn't touch the bottle, let alone cause it to rock the way that it did. The window was closed, so there was no breeze and anybody else in the room. I tried to replicate it another time by blowing hard on the bottle, flapping my arms and holding myself in the same position as when it happened, but I couldn't touch or move the bottle at all. Even with the generous leeway, I couldn't touch that bottle, and in short, it wasn't me, and genuinely, it ruined my night because this incident absolutely terrified me. A couple of days later, I was in the same bathroom, washing my hands at about the same time at night, when I experienced a sudden and intense sensation that something sinister was behind me and staring at me. I looked up at the mirror and couldn't see anything behind me, but I just felt like something was there. I was too afraid to move. I finished washing my hands after a minute or so, and when the feeling began to fade, I quickly left the bathroom. But this became a regular occurrence. Particularly in the kitchen and the bathroom, I felt something there, or that something was watching me, and sort of attempting to interact with me too. The presence was somewhat imposing and dark. I could never see it, but I just felt like it was there. My partner didn't believe me when I told him about these incidents, and would go to bed before me, so he never witnessed them at first. I believe this presence was a man, and for a while thought that it might have been the deceased elderly man who used to live here. He was placed in a care home aged 95, and was known as a nasty, horrible old man. The man passed away at some point. I'm not sure when, but it was either during the incidents or towards the end of them. Additionally, we had a living room carpet, and as these incidents increased in frequency, I began to hear something plucking at the carpet in the corner by the door. When I moved the curtain, there was nothing ever there, and the noise always stopped. But this is where my partner comes in, because he stayed up later occasionally, and he heard the noise too. Mind you, I didn't prompt him. I heard it and remained quiet until he picked up on it, and I told him that that was the noise that I was hearing. He went to investigate, and he couldn't see anything, and this is what made him suspicious too. Now, we have a rabbit, but we checked on him. He was in his cage eating in the next room while the noises happened, and unless he could teleport, pluck the carpet before our eyes while invisible, and teleport back into his cage, and it definitely wasn't him. Since then, I lifted the floor to see if anything could have plucked the carpet from beneath the floorboards, but the floorboards are locked tight, and honestly it would have been impossible to touch the underside of the carpet or underlay or whatever. This may be my mind manifesting fear too, but I also began to have horrible dreams about an old man with beady, shiny black eyes, a partially bald head, and white hair in a forest. I recognized the layout from a forest far away in my hometown that I used to ride a horse in. These dreams were disturbing to say the least, and the men were not like ordinary people. I felt they were trying to toy with me before they killed me, and one night I woke up to feel someone standing over me. Another, I woke up and briefly glimpsed black writing all over the wall on the landing, and when I blinked it vanished. I was honestly terrified and often felt something on the landing or in the room too. I had no history of sleep paralysis before moving to this house. My partner told me that he believed that whatever it was enjoyed scaring me and was feeding on my fear. I tried after this to not to be afraid and to confront it, which honestly worked to some degree in the end. But one of the worst incidents was when I knew the man was there. I felt him standing about 2 feet away from my computer chair. He liked to stand over me and sometimes breathe on me while I was gaming. I was playing World of Warcraft. I remember exactly what I was doing. I knew that he was trying to get my attention, and so I ignored him. I forced myself to calm down. Then he moved closer, and I heard a huff as though someone breathed heavily through their mouth, only inches from my ear. I took my headset off and looked around, but the presence had disappeared, probably into the kitchen. I felt like he wanted me to follow him, so I did. My attention was guided out of the window as though he was leading me there. I went to the window and looked out, and I swear to you that I saw a shape out there that looked like an adult male of about 6 feet wearing a grey hoodie and gloves standing near my back fence as though he had just climbed over. Could I have been mistaken? Yes, for sure, but I tried to run from the window and ended up in a freeze mode by the kitchen door, because for some reason, I just couldn't move. I tried so hard to get away because I thought this man was going to break into my house and attack me or something. I don't know where the man was, but after about 2 minutes, I finally made it into the living room. 2 more and I went back to check. The man and the real man were both gone. A strange part of me believed, though, that the man chased the real figure off. In fact, I felt as though he had tried to save me that night, and I guess I became more sympathetic to him. There was another incident, though, which could be explained otherwise, but my partner wasn't convinced. We had a small children's desk with 2 wooden chairs behind us. We stacked the chairs on the table while our daughter was upstairs. While we were on the computers, the chairs just suddenly came crashing to the floor. Mind you, they were not precariously stacked or anything. The doors were open and there was a bit of a breeze, but there's just no way the wind would have been able to knock over the small wooden chairs to the floor like that. This also happened in broad daylight in the late afternoon. Now, over time, this all began to fade. I feared the man less. I often felt his presence in the kitchen, standing far too close to me. One time, I even felt a sudden icy blow down the left side of my neck. Our house is cold and drafty, so although I convinced myself that it was him, it could have been something else, I admit. My nightmares, though, they began to disappear. I would hear him sometimes walking upstairs, and I sensed him go into my daughter's bedroom just to look at her. He never did anything in there, but my partner also experienced something going on in the house on several occasions, but he is still somewhat of a skeptic. Eventually, though, everything just stopped one day. But after the man disappeared, we had issues with, like, animal footsteps on the stairs, a scurrying. It was weird and creepy. It sort of sounded like a cat running up and down, I guess. The first time it happened, we couldn't see anything. The plucking noise continued, and it was around this time our house rabbit for some reason jumped out of his cage, and we had at least 2 to 3 incidences where he bolted up the stairs and went into our bedroom. He was running about, and this was really abnormal for him. Of course, we blamed him and locked his cage tightly so he couldn't escape, but the noise continued. My ex was also woken by the noise one night and investigated them, only to find the rabbit in his cage and the noises continuing. The noises and the incidences have stopped for quite some time now, thankfully. The house now feels at peace, but honestly, that was a deeply terrifying event that actually ruined my life and made me feel really unsafe in my own home at night.